This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Seems like the world has gone mad within the last 7 days. Are we looking at the end of days? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert, doing a rare solo program this evening. In fact, I'm not sure during the 13 years that I've been recording this program that I've done more than one or two of these solo programs. But with what's going on in Ukraine right now, my prayer is that this program will help us to approach this situation from a more biblical perspective. I've seen some on both sides of the political spectrum, Christians on all sides, trying to make sense of this. This is a confrontation that doesn't fit the standard narrative, and I'll explain what I mean here in just a moment. We've also got a couple of new things to tell you about. With travel opening back up, there's some new conferences to tell you about, a new virtual conference to tell you about, but two that are coming up in just the next couple of weeks. So I want to get those out of the way right at the outset, in case you've been looking for an opportunity to gather together with other believers. There are a couple of opportunities where we can spend the weekend together, more or less, just coming up here in the next few weeks, here in the month of March 2022. This coming weekend, March 4th through 6th, Sharon and I will be essentially teaching all weekend long. This is an annual thing. It's become an annual thing anyway. The last 2 years now, 3 years. This will be our third time back there at His Call Ministries in Sparta, Missouri. They've got a beautiful facility there called Finley River Ranch. The Finley is an offshoot of the James River, which leads into Table Rock Lake. It's a beautiful setting, cozy, no more than 100 people at most. And Sharon and I will be teaching Friday night, that is March the 4th, all day Saturday, and Saturday morning and afternoon, and then again Sunday morning. And lunch will be provided on Saturday and Sunday. So an opportunity to gather together. We're titling the weekend The Return of Saturn and the Great Reset, although we may change some of our discussion topics now with what's going on in Eastern Europe. But you can find out more at hiscallministries.com. I'm told there's still room, but again, it fills up quickly because it's a rather cozy facility. Hiscallministries.com is the website, hiscallministries.com. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll be going to Dallas. We'll be returning to Dallas for the first time since 2020. When the Hear the Watchman conference was about the last big gathering of believers, at least in our little alternative slice of the body of Christ, before they shut down travel. Hear the Watchman, the Eyes to See conference, March 17th through 20th at the Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center. This is in Grapevine, Texas, very close to the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. L.A. Marzulli will be speaking, Dr. Michael Lake, Pastor Paul Begley, Pastor Casper McLeod, Coach Dave Daubenmeier, Jamie Walden, Sheila Zielinski will be joining us. So we haven't seen Sheila face-to-face since, I think, 2015. So she'll be there, Dave Hodges of The Common Sense Show, Thomas Dunn, and more. And we can save you $20 on registration there by using promo code Gilbert20, Gilbert20 at checkout. And again, that's at hearthewatchmen.com. Again, some other new conferences to tell you about, including one at a very cool location that Sharon and I were at back in 2016, and a new Skywatch TV conference to tell you about, but we'll do that at the end of this program. What's going on in Russia, in Ukraine rather, is really got the political spectrum here in the United States in a turmoil. It's been really strange. Having paid a lot of attention to the news for a long time, Sharon and I are both kind of news junkies. We're old enough to remember 10 years ago, which really isn't that long ago, but you've probably noticed if you've paid any attention to the news for a period of time as an adult, that it's like watching a soap opera or pro wrestling, in that when you watch it long enough, the guys that you used to hate are now the heroes, and the guys you used to cheer for are now the bad guys. It's like they just have to come up with a new script. So suddenly the heels are the faces, and the faces are the heels. Wrestling terminology, face short for baby face, one of the good guy wrestlers. And really, that's how the political game is played. They posture and preen for the cameras, and then behind the scenes, when the cameras are off, they go out for drinks. Same true in wrestling, by the way. I am reliably informed by friends with connections to that industry. So back in 2012, when Barack Obama was running for re-election, his opponent, the Republican the Republican nominee, Mitt Romney, made the comment during one of their televised debates that America's number one geopolitical adversary was Russia. And Obama mocked Senator Romney, saying, well, the 1980s called and they want their foreign policy back. Haven't you heard the Cold War is over? Something to that effect. And of course, the liberal intelligentsia here in the United States thought that was just brilliant and had a good laugh at Mitt Romney's expense. Romney is now, trying to come back on that and say, hey, see, I was right all along. Well, it's not that Putin has changed. It's that, again, the script here in the United States has changed. And that's what I want to address. Sometime between 2013, between 2012 and 2016, Vladimir Putin suddenly became the bad guy. Russia became the villain again. You remember how Hillary Clinton lost because of Russia's interference? That's not really true, of course, but that's the claim that's being made. Well, Russia is now being demonized for a reason that I think makes a lot of sense. And see if I can find my notes here as I'm kind of doing this on the fly today. Michael Snyder, who writes a lot at the Economic Collapse blog, he, I thought, had a really insightful post. I don't agree with everything that Michael Snyder writes, but this, I think, was right on target in identifying the reason that the liberals here in America are suddenly demonizing Russia after years and years of saying, hey, look, the Cold War is over. And, remember Joe McCarthy? Wasn't he evil? Well, that bizarre flip in the span of 4 years from the 2012 presidential campaign to the 2016 election, where we're supposed to believe that Russia, which bought about $50,000 worth of Facebook ads, that the $50,000 in Facebook ads offset the hundreds of millions that Hillary and the Democratic National Committee spent in advertising. What is it really that turned the left in the United States, but also the West in general, against Russia, fully against Russia? I think Michael Snyder's onto something here. In 2013, Russia passed a law that banned all forms of gay propaganda directed at children. They are not allowed to promote through entertainment, music, social media, whatever, the values that the Russian government finds objectionable. And same-sex marriage is not allowed in Russia. In fact, that was a constitutional amendment that was passed by the Russian voters in 2020. So in 2013, the Russian government passed a law outlawing proselytizing, if you will, by the LGBTQI plus community. And in 2020, Russia passed a constitutional amendment permanently defining marriage as the union of one man and one woman. And also in 2020, Vladimir Putin started a program designed to cut the number of abortions in Russia in half by 2025, and as part of his plan to improve abortion prevention strategies. So Western elites have thus decided that Russia must be destroyed. Now, if you followed Sharon or me for any length of time, we try to do our best to look behind the headlines because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. It's the principalities and powers behind the scenes that influence the actors in the news. So what's going on behind the scenes? Sharon, a couple of years ago in San Antonio, gave a brilliant presentation. I think she's done it a couple of times since then, on the goddess Inanna as the spirit of the age. The ancient Sumerian goddess Inanna, called Ishtar by the Akkadians and Babylonians, Astarte in the Bible, Aphrodite by the Greeks, Venus by the Romans, other names throughout history, also called Queen of Heaven, quite frankly. And that's not me making this up. I don't have an axe to grind there as far as denominations. That's the conclusion of secular, peer-reviewed scholarship. Inanna is well known for being the world's first, probably the world's first gender-fluid entity. There are ancient Sumerian hymns that have been preserved that praise her for being able to change men into women and women into men. And I think she is, you can make a really good case that she is the spirit of the age. In fact, when Moses came down the mountain with the law, and when you read through the book of Leviticus and get to those parts that you don't want to read out loud with children in the room, it's not because God, the God of the Bible, Yahweh, was trying to invent things for the Israelites not to do. These weren't things that people just weren't doing, and God decided to outlaw them anyway in advance just because, or just in case. No, it's because these things were being done by the people of the ancient Near East. And God said, this is not how you're supposed to live. Here is the standard of morality. When Moses came down that mountain in 1446 BC or thereabouts, that was progressive thought. That was progressive because that was a change from literally thousands of years of behavior in the ancient Near East. So when we see a world leader like Vladimir Putin leading an entire nation to go against that, what we're told now is liberal standard of sexual morality, Inanna is not pleased. In fact, Sharon has also made a very good case, and I agree with her, that Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, etc., is Babylon the Great, Mystery Babylon, the woman who rides the beast in the book of Revelation. She thinks that she is going to somehow control events in the end times, and she is not pleased. Now, before you think that I'm praising Vladimir Putin for this, let me add this. I do not believe that Putin is doing this because he is the savior of Christendom. He is not standing in the gap to preserve biblical morality as such. I think he's simply looking at numbers and doing the math. And when you look at demographics, population numbers, Russia is a dying nation. So is the United States, by the way. We've been so heavily indoctrinated by the globalists and their claim that the earth is going to run out of arable land or livable land, and we need to start cutting back on the number of babies that we have. Otherwise, we're going to overrun the population of the earth. That is not true. There's a book that was written a couple of years ago by a couple of Canadians, an investigative journalist and a professional demographer, who actually ran the numbers and found that the world's population is going to begin to decline within about 30 years. The world's population is going to peak and then begin to decline in the second half of the 21st century. And the point of their book, which I forget now, I think Population Bust, is that we may be facing a demographic winter. We may be facing the beginning of the end of humanity if the Lord tarries. Their point is that once that curve begins to trend down, unless something radical happens, we may not be able to change that curve because the population is aging. And as the population ages, it becomes more difficult to have more children. So this is why Russia is trying to reverse this trend by cutting down on the number of children that are terminated before they're born. The birth rate in Russia right now is on average 1.8, a little less than 1.8 live births per woman. To maintain a stable population, you've got to have 2.1. So Russia's not having enough children to maintain its population. The United States population birth rate is about 1.8 also. So we are also declining. Asia, same way. In some parts of Asia, like Hong Kong and South Korea, it's below, I think in Hong Kong, I think it's below one live birth or fewer than one live births per woman on average. Japan has got a new class of like a job title, which I can't pronounce, but essentially these are people whose job it is to go and find elderly people who have died alone because their population is growing increasingly old. There are serious social and economic consequences coming from this. Just looking at the social and economic consequences, we here in the United States, we're already acknowledging that the Social Security system is not sustainable because you've got too many people drawing on the Social Security plan for the number of workers who are paying into it to support. And those numbers aren't going to get any better because, I'm the tail end of the baby boom and I just turned 60. So the bulge in the population curve is older than me. And as we get older and need more medical care, need more social services, things that we've paid into all of our lives, this Ponzi scheme that we call Social Security. The young workforce is going to be under increasing pressure from higher and higher taxation, and there will be social consequences for that. And we in the United States are not alone. Most of Europe is in the same boat. In fact, almost the entire northern hemisphere, except for the Middle East, is in that situation. China, we've heard for years, China's one-child policy, one child. You may not have heard, but China now has a three-child policy. They dropped the one-child policy several years ago, and just a few weeks ago, they've changed it now to a three-child policy because China, like Russia, looking beyond the economic and social consequences of an aging, declining population base, realizes that if you're trying to continue to project force outside of your borders, you need a military. And if you got these guys, the guys are aging out to where they're no longer effective soldiers, you're going to need more babies. So China now actually encouraging families to have more than 2 children and shutting down abortion centers left and right, just like Russia. But again, it's not because Vladimir Putin is the defender of Christendom. And I don't know what's in his heart. Who knows? He may be a genuine believer in Jesus Christ, despite what we've seen this past week with the invasion of Ukraine. But I think it's more about the geopolitical implications of not having enough soldiers, not having enough people to actually occupy the world's largest landmass by any one nation. There's a lot of fallow farmland in Russia. In fact, a delegation of Boers, those are the Dutch descendants of the Dutch settlers of South Africa, went to Moscow a couple of years ago to ask if there was any way they could just move en masse to Russia and take over some of that untilled farmland because things in South Africa are becoming dicey. So anyway, that is, and it's interesting because this aspect of Russia's social policies have attracted the support of some Christians here in the West who are just looking at the pietist aspect of it. Oh, yes, encouraging children is a good thing. Discouraging abortion is a good thing. So we support President Putin. Well, okay, look deeper at what he's actually doing here. Is it really because he supports a biblical standard of morality, or because he recognizes that if they don't have more children, Russia is essentially going to fade away? I don't know. I can't answer that question, but I certainly think that that's possible. One thing we can agree on is that Vladimir Putin is ruthless. He will do whatever he can to promote the interests of his nation. He is certainly a patriot and believes that Russia should be returned to great nation status, which it held back in the 18th, 19th centuries. And maybe he does see Russia as the last bastion of Christendom, which is a role that Russia has played in the past during those centuries when Russia was pretty much what stood between the Ottoman Empire and Western Europe. But for whatever reason, and again, looking beyond the headlines to the principalities and powers, for some reason, the West seems bound and determined to keep poking the Russian bear. Now, what has happened over the last week or so? Could this have been avoided? And I know that Donald Trump is down at CPAC this weekend as I'm recording this, and he's telling everyone who will listen that this would never have happened if he were president. Maybe he's right. I don't know. But it's more than just what's happened over the last year since Joe Biden took office. Feckless is a word that I think aptly describes Biden and his foreign policy team. Feckless, clueless, and there are a few other things they're missing, but I won't get crude. But this is a much older conflict that goes back a long, long time. I mean, you look at the great game of geopolitics taking place in the 19th century between Great Britain on the one hand and Russia on the other. And just wondered, what is this all about? And continuing into the 21st century, especially as we're looking at all across the Northern Hemisphere, Russia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, North America, China emerging as the world's soon-to-be dominant superpower, why are we pushing Russia into China's orbit instead of trying to work to strengthen ties with a country with which we have more in common, both culturally and religiously, historically, than Russia and China do? I mean, Russia and China historically have been enemies. We're kind of forcing them, to become strange bedfellows. Pat Buchanan wrote a column this past week, and I remember when he ran for president and his speech, which included the image of Marines on American streets to keep the peace, scared me, but that's when I was young and liberal. I still don't think that's a good idea, by the way. But I will say that over time, I've come to realize that Pat Buchanan is right about a lot of things, including a lot of things that are not politically correct, for which he is usually tarred as a racist by the liberal media. But of course, in America today, if you don't agree with the liberal agenda as defined by the most extreme elements within the Democratic Party right now, you are a racist. So, all right, fine. Don't care anymore. Buchanan pointed out a number of things that we are not hearing from our media here. And again, this is not to take the side of Vladimir Putin. We can agree that he's a brilliant geopolitical strategist without saying, I fully endorse everything that he's doing. People are dying in Ukraine right now because of the decisions that he's made this past week. And I condemn him for that. But at the same time, you can understand to an extent why he is doing what he's doing. Buchanan wrote, in the Bucharest Declaration of 2008, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this is basically Western Europe and North America, we've got a mutual defense pact essentially aligned against Russia. If Russia attacks a member of NATO, Article 5 of the NATO Charter says that the rest of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization must come to that nation's defense. We are contractually, legally, and morally bound to defend. In the Bucharest Declaration of 2008, NATO had put Ukraine and Georgia, even farther east in the Caucasus, on a path to membership in NATO and coverage under Article 5 of the treaty, which declares an attack on any one member is an attack on all. Look at a map. Georgia is on Russia's southern border. Ukraine borders Russia on Russia's western border, just south of Belarus. Unable to get a satisfactory answer to his demand, Putin invaded and settled the issue. Now, he invaded northern Georgia. There were a couple breakaway regions there, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And actually, President Saakashvili of Georgia invaded South Ossetia and killed some Russian peacekeepers, after which Russia responded. You normally don't hear it described that way in the American media. We normally hear it as, Putin invaded Georgia. It was after the Georgian military went in and killed some Russian soldiers that were there at the request of the mainly Russian population of those regions of Georgia. Anyway, Putin invaded and settled the issue. Neither Ukraine nor Georgia will become members of NATO. To prevent that, Russia will go to war as Russia did this week. Putin did exactly what he had warned us he would do. He's been saying this for quite some time, that Ukraine in NATO was a non-starter. And because politicians in the West didn't want to show weakness to Putin, he said, oh, no, we're not taking that off the table. We're not letting Ukraine in, but we're not going to say we're not going to let them in either. When Putin warns that he will do something, he does it. How did we get here? And where do we go from here, Buchanan asks. How did we get to where Russia, believing its back is against a wall, and the United States, by moving NATO ever closer, put it there, reached a point where it chose war with Ukraine rather than accepting the fate and future it believes the West has in store for Mother Russia? Consider, between 1989 and 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev let the Berlin Wall be pulled down, Germany be reunited, and all the captive nations of Eastern Europe go free. Having collapsed the Soviet Empire, Gorbachev allowed the Soviet Union to dissolve itself into 15 independent nations. Communism was allowed to expire as the ruling ideology of Russia, the land where Leninism and Bolshevism first took root in 1917. Gorbachev called off the Cold War in Europe by removing all of the causes on Moscow's side of the historic divide. Putin, a former KGB colonel, came to power in 1999 after the disastrous decade-long rule of Boris Yeltsin, who ran Russia into the ground. In that year, 1999, Putin watched as America conducted a 78-day bombing campaign on Serbia, the Balkan nation that had historically been a protectorate of Mother Russia. And by the way, it did that in support of a breakaway region of Serbia, Kosovo, becoming an independent nation. I guess it's okay when they want to break away from countries that are favorable to Russia, but it's not okay when the country is leaning towards the United States. Against whom were these countries, or rather, that year also, three former Warsaw Pact nations, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, were brought into NATO, which, by the way, was contrary to the promises made to Gorbachev when he agreed to dissolve the Soviet Union and pull down the Berlin Wall. We promised we would never admit former Soviet Union nations into NATO. So he pulled down the wall, dissolved the Soviet Union, and then 10 years later, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary in NATO. And the response to the Russians was, well, you should have got it in writing. Well, against whom were these countries to be protected by U.S. arms in the NATO alliance? The question was fairly asked. The question seemed to be answered fully in 2004 when Slovenia, Slovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, and Bulgaria were admitted into NATO, a grouping that included three former republics of the USSR itself, as well as three more former Warsaw Pact nations. Then in 2008 came the Bucharest Declaration that put Georgia and Ukraine, both bordering on Russia, on a path to NATO membership. Georgia, the same year, attacked its seceded province of South Ossetia, where Russian troops were acting as peacekeepers, killing some. This triggered a Putin counterattack through the Rocky Tunnel in North Ossetia that liberated South Ossetia and moved into Georgia all the way to Gori, the birthplace of Joseph Stalin. George W. Bush, who had pledged to end tyranny in our world, did nothing. After briefly occupying part of Russia, or part of Georgia, that is, the Russians departed, but stayed as protectors of South Ossetians. The U.S. establishment has declared this to have been a Russian war of aggression, but an investigation by the European Union blamed Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili for starting the war. In 2014, a democratically elected pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown in Kyiv and replaced by a pro-Western regime. Rather than lose Sevastopol, Russia's historic naval base in Crimea, Putin seized the peninsula and declared it a Russian territory. And this, by the way, was after the people of Crimea voted heavily in favor of leaving Ukraine and joining Russia. The majority population there is Russian. Teddy Roosevelt stole Panama with similar remorse. Which brings us to today. Whatever we may think of Putin, he is no Stalin. He has not murdered millions or created a Gulag archipelago, nor is he irrational, as some pundits rail. He does not want a war with us, which would be worse than ruinous to us both. Putin is a Russian nationalist, patriot, traditionalist, and a cold and ruthless realist looking out to preserve Russia as the great and respected power it once was, and he believes it can be again. But it cannot be that if NATO expansion does not stop, or if its sister state of Ukraine becomes part of a military alliance whose proudest boast is that it won the Cold War against the nation Putin has served all his life. President Joe Biden almost hourly promises we are not going to war in Ukraine. Why would he then not readily rule out NATO membership for Ukraine, which require us to do something Biden himself says we Americans, for our own survival, should never do: go to war with Russia? That is the question. And the question has already been answered in Putin's mind. We won't, and so Ukraine is essentially his for the taking. Now, I don't know that he wants to occupy Ukraine for any length of time. Just looking at it pragmatically, trying to rule a bunch of really angry Ukrainians is probably not a good use of Russian manpower or military resources. But he would certainly be happy if there was a pro-Russian government in place, which it had until 2014, which, by the way, that Maidan revolution in 2014 that overthrew Yanukovych was backed by the United States. You might remember that famous phone call. Victoria Nuland of the State Department was leaked by Russian intelligence on the phone with contact inside Ukraine, basically telling her contact inside Ukraine who the United States was going to pick for the next to be the next president of Ukraine. And when she was told that the European Union had a different candidate in mind, Nuland famously said, "F the EU." The Obama administration had it in mind that we had the right and the power to dictate what was going on in a nation on Russia's border. Putin called a bluff, preserved his naval base in Sevastopol by seizing Crimea, and what he's doing now is making sure that Ukraine never, ever enters NATO. He may also be trying to establish a land bridge to Crimea, a land route, I should say. They've got a bridge, an 11-mile bridge that crosses from Russia to Crimea, but certainly that's not the most effective, efficient way or safe way if you get into a shooting match with somebody. That bridge is vulnerable. But that's, I think, a good analysis of the situation. Putin has been telling us for years, don't do this or I'll be, or I will, stop it. And we kept pushing. It's possible that the Biden administration felt it had to swagger and stand up to Putin after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is one of the most humiliating incidents in American history. Made the country and made him look weak. And so maybe he felt he had no choice. Sadly, the Ukrainian people who've been led down the primrose path here are paying the price for it, because it's pretty clear now that the promises of American protection, which we've made for years, really don't amount to much. Okay, we'll send you some guns. We'll send you some ammo. As I'm recording this afternoon, it was announced that the White House has approved $350 million more of arms and ammunition for the Ukrainian people. But how are we supposed to get it there when Russia is essentially in control of the skies over Ukraine? I mean, are we going to risk sending planes or copters in where they might be shot down? Or are they going to do that and gamble that Russian forces will not shoot them down? But then what happens when American weapons start killing Russian soldiers? This is, these are dark days. And I don't know that this could have been avoided. Again, I'm not going to say that Donald Trump is right by claiming that this would not have happened if he were still in office. It may very well have. We'll never know. But this is not a problem that developed in the last year. This is a problem that the political elites here in the West have allowed to develop over the last 30 years of Ukrainian independence. And I'll just say this as an illustration. If, for example, Mexico were to announce that it had signed a mutual defense treaty with China and that China would soon begin basing troops and weapons on Mexican territory, that would not stand. It would not end well. The United States would cross the border to make sure that did not. Well, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were people inside the White House who wanted John F. Kennedy to nuke Cuba. Thankfully, he did not. But the consequences of what happened there and also the Bay of Pigs fiasco probably contributed to President Kennedy's untimely death. Anyway, let's pray that there are those inside the White House with cooler heads who are not actually arguing for a shooting war with Russia. I saw a tweet come from an Illinois congressman, Republican, Rhino, Adam Kinzinger. He's one of the members of the January 6th Commission, along with Liz Cheney, the two Republicans on that commission. And he was actually agitating for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. This is just as insane as Hillary Clinton when she argued during her presidential campaign for a no-fly zone over Syria. That means having to shoot down Russian planes which means starting a war with Russia. As Mr. Buchanan said, it would be worse than ruinous for both nations. Nobody wants it. So let's start thinking, with our heads instead of continuing this little competition of trying to prove who's manlier, okay? Now, the other thing I wanted to address, and I think as I'm getting into this, I probably will spend less time on this than I thought I would up front, and that is the prophetic implications of Russia getting involved in a military conflict. Because I've seen a number of Christian sites online suggesting that this war is perhaps the beginning of the Gog-Magog conflict. And I think that is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Ezekiel 38 and 39. I wrote at length about this, and I'm going to try to scan through this and summarize the bullet points. So again, I'm doing this on the fly. I wrote about this in my book, Last Clash of the Titans. If you've got a copy of the book, it begins at around page 147, chapter 7 of that book. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention from the prophetic community. Not that I expected it to, because they think I'm weird. We talk about the Nephilim and prophetic implications of the Nephilim. So we don't get a lot of attention, and that's fine. But the only reason, and the reason I'm bringing this out, is not to try to show off how smart I am, and I have to watch myself for that. Very old character trait that goes back to my childhood, when I realized at a very young age that I was reading at a higher level than most of my friends. I've now reached an age where I should have learned by now that I'm usually not the smartest person in the room. In fact, when I'm in any room with my wife, I know for a fact that's not true. So I just want this to put this out here because I think this is a more accurate understanding of what we're looking at with the Gog-Magog war. The idea that Russia played a key role in end times prophecy really dates back to, I was going to say the Scofield Reference Bible, but actually it predates that a little bit. Back in the 19th century, scholars Wilhelm Gesenius and C.F. Kyle translated the Hebrew word Rosh, R-O-S-H, which you see in Ezekiel 38, verse 3, in the verse where Gog is described as the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. They translated the Hebrew word Rosh as a proper noun, in other words, a name. And that would change the verse from Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, to Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Well, this was picked up by Scofield, and the Scofield Reference Bible, published in 1909 and then republished in 1917, which, remember, was just about the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Scofield wrote this, that the primary reference is to the northern European powers headed up by Russia all agree. The whole passage should be read in connection with Zechariah 12, verses 1 through 4, Zechariah 14, verses 1 through 9, Matthew 24, verses 14 through 30, Revelation 14, 14 through 20, and Revelation 19, 17 through 21. He's correct about all of that. Scofield continues, Gog is the prince, Magog his land. The reference to Meshech and Tubal, parentheses, Moscow and Tobolsk, close parentheses, is a clear mark of identification. Russia and the northern powers have been the latest persecutors of dispersed Israel, and it is congruous, both with divine justice and with the covenants, that destruction should fall at the climax of the last mad attempt to exterminate the remnant of Israel in Jerusalem. Scofield wrote this. Now, again, in 1917, coming as it did on the heels of or in the midst of the Bolshevik Revolution, and the fact that there was no nation state of Israel at that time, made this a very popular interpretation of Ezekiel 38 and 39 in the Gog-Magog war. He's the chief prince of Russia, Moscow, and Tobolsk, the leader of the coalition. Since the Cold War, this interpretation of Ezekiel 38 and 39 has become sort of entrenched in prophecy circles, to the point where anytime there's a political or military tension between the West and Russia, Gog is getting ready to ride. Gog of Magog. I don't think this, well, no, let me put it this way. This is based on a faulty interpretation of the Hebrew word Rosh. How would readers in Ezekiel's day have understood that word and understood the prophecy? That is what we should ask anytime we read end times prophecy. Now, clearly there are some things that are intended for our day that maybe Ezekiel wouldn't have understood. I'm open to that idea, but he wasn't just writing for readers in the United States 2,600 years in the future. Ezekiel was also writing for the remnant of Israel in Babylonia and those who had not been driven out of the land in what later became Judea and Judah. Rosh is not a name. It is not a proper noun. In Ezekiel's day, there was no people group anywhere or location that can be positively identified, that can connect with the word Rosh. In Hebrew, it means chief, or more accurately, it means head. Gog is the head prince of Meshech and Tubal. That's what it means. You've heard the word, the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. That's what that means. Rosh is not Russia. Now, some argue that the hordes of Magog are coming from the uttermost north, but when you draw a line north from Jerusalem, well, there's nothing further north on the map than Russia, so it must be Russia. That is from the Hebrew phrase Yarkatei Tsephon, which only used a few times in the Old Testament. Yarkatei Tsephon, uttermost north. We find it also in Psalm 42, a comparison between Mount Zion and Yarkatei Tsephon. And we also see it in Isaiah 14. That's that famous chapter. How art thou fallen, O Lucifer, son of the morning? He wants to establish his divine assembly, his mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I'm going to bring this up here so I can read that and not try to remember it off the top of my head. Sadly, I have not mastered the art of memorizing scripture, which, if they ever shut down the internet and I can't access my electronic Bibles, I've got paper Bibles, I just don't use them as often as I should. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, or Lucifer, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. That's the English Standard Version, the ESV translation. But their footnote there makes note, and it says this, or in the remote parts of Tsaphon. See, in the ancient world, Mount Tsaphon was well known as the place where Baal's palace was located. In fact, it's even connected to the Greek equivalent of Baal, like Baal, the storm god, king of the pantheon, name of Zeus. It was believed that Zeus defeated the chaos god Typhon there at Mount Tsaphon. In fact, some scholars believe that the name of this chaos monster, Typhon, derives from the name of this mountain, Tsaphon. And that mountain, like the rest of the people mentioned in that northern coalition, is located in Turkey today. It's called Jebel al-Akra. It is very close to ancient Antioch, where Christians were first called by that name. And by the way, we're going to visit Antioch on our tour of, it's called Antakya today. We're going to visit it on our tour of Turkey. We'll tell you about that in just a little bit. The other group, and we'll talk a little bit about the other members of this coalition, Persia or Iran, Cush, which is either Ethiopia and or Sudan, Put is Libya. We'll talk about why those are relevant in just a minute. The other players, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah. Now, interestingly, we can find all of these names in chapter 10 of Genesis. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Medai, Yavan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. So they're all there in Genesis 10. They're all descendants of Japheth, so not Hamites and not Semites. The Hebrew name Gomer, in all likelihood, refers to the Cimmerians, or with a C in front of it, might be Cimmerians. I should have looked up the pronunciation. Anyway, they're well-known people in the ancient world. The Akkadians called them Gemuru, which means complete. They migrated south from the steppes of Europe or Eurasia and attacked Assyria in the late 7th century BC. This is about 100 years before Ezekiel wrote his prophecy. The Assyrians called them the Gimerai. The Cimmerian king Tushpa was defeated by Assur-Haddon of Assyria sometime between 681 and 668 BC. Now, because of the Assyrians, whose base of power was in what is now northern Iraq today, kind of like the people who occupied the northern part of Iraq. What am I thinking? The Kurds, the Kurdish territories of northern Iraq and northern Syria. That was sort of the homeland for the Assyrians. So the Cimmerians, instead of raiding to the east and angering the Assyrians, they usually went west into Anatolia. And in one of these raids, they conquered the powerful kingdom, formerly powerful kingdom of Phrygia in west central Turkey, whose most famous leader was named Midas. That Midas, the guy with the golden touch. Yeah, he was a historical character. Anyway, the Cimmerians eventually settled in Cappadocia, which is now eastern Turkey or east central Turkey, and they faded from history after the 7th century BC. We will be seeing Cappadocia on that tour of Turkey and some really fascinating stuff there. Anyway, Beth Togarmah, or the House of Togarmah, in Assyrian texts referred to as Til Garimu. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, who came down and besieged Jerusalem, campaigned against the city of the Togarmites in 695 BC. There are Hittite texts that refer to a district of Tegarama on the upper Euphrates River in Turkey. This was captured by the Hittite king Sepaluluyuma in the mid-14th century BC. Again, definitely within the borders of modern Turkey. Meshech and Tubal, also known from Akkadian texts. There were two different groups called the Mushki in Assyrian sources, one from the 12th through 9th centuries. This would be from the time of the judges through the time of, King Ahab. This is near the head of the Euphrates River in eastern Turkey. The other from the 8th to the 7th centuries, the Western Mushki in, and this is BC, by the way, in Cappadocia and Cilicia. So again, a little further to the west there. The men of Meshech first appear in secular history, and again, I'm summarizing from my book, Last Clash of the Titans. Around 1100 BC, they're mentioned in inscriptions of Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria. The Assyrian king tells of fighting 5 kings of the Mushki who led a coalition from what is today Armenia down south to the core territory of Assyria. And interestingly, the war between Assyria and the Mushki was over control of Tubal. Again, that area between in eastern Turkey near what is now Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, kind of in that region there. Magog, Ezekiel 39 verse 6 gives us a clue to the location of Magog's homeland. The war of Gog and Magog will bring fire on Magog and on those who dwell securely in the coastlands. So this points to Western Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean, in other words, Greece. And again, going back to Genesis 10, the sons of Japheth include Yavan and Tiras, who is identified as the father of the Teresh, one of the sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian texts who destroyed a lot of the eastern Mediterranean region around 1150 BC. The Teragians may have migrated west to Italy and become the Etruscan civilization. But the bottom line is we are once again looking at a group of people who in Ezekiel's day would have been identified with Anatolia, or what we today call Turkey. Now, so does that mean Gog of Magog, Gog is going to come from Turkey? Well, again, going back to Isaiah 14 and this reference to Zaphon, Mount Zaphon. Remember, Gog of Magog is the supernatural enemy of God and Israel, the greatest end times enemy of Israel. In other words, Gog is the Antichrist in the Old Testament. And we've written in a couple places, Last Clash of the Titans. I think we also discussed this in Giants, Gods, and Dragons a bit. why we believe the war of Gog and Magog concludes at Armageddon. In Ezekiel 39, there is a description of a rather gruesome feast that takes place at the end of this war. Besides the fact that in Ezekiel 39, verse 7, God says, I will not let my holy name be profaned anymore, and the nations shall know that I am Yahweh, the Holy One in Israel. That we've got many references in the Old Testament to the Holy One of Israel, but this is the only place, Ezekiel 39:7, at the end of the war of Gog and Magog, where he says he's the Holy One in Israel, which means he's returned. He's back. He's on the battlefield. Armageddon. He's the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19. This is him in Ezekiel 39. And then in Ezekiel 39:17, Ezekiel is told to prophesy, speak to the birds of every sort and to all beasts of the field, assemble and come, gather from all around to the sacrificial feast that I'm preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast on the mountains of Israel, and you shall eat flesh and drink blood. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty, the Gibborim is the word there, and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, and of he-goats, of bulls, all of them fat beasts of Bashan. Any reference to Bashan in the Old Testament is charged with spiritual meaning. This is a reference to the principalities and powers that have deceived the world into believing that they are the gods of the pagan world. That's who constitutes the feast at the end of the Gog-Magog war. But we see that same feast in Revelation chapter 19. John writes, beginning at verse 17, Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly directly overhead, Come, gather for the great supper of God to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, Gibborim, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great. It's the same thing, and I've written about this last Clash of the Titans, why there are other references in here to, like the fall of Babylon the Great. Fallen is Babylon the Great. That's an echo of Ezekiel 26 and 27 and the collapse of Tyre prophesied by Ezekiel. So since this ends at Armageddon, and Armageddon, by the way, is not at Megiddo. It is a reference to the Mount of Assembly, the phrase used by the rebel in Eden in Isaiah chapter 14, who, by the way, I argue in my new book, The Second Coming of Saturn, is not Satan. It is Shemiyaza that's in view in Isaiah 14, but that's another story. Isaiah 14, verse 13, where this rebel says, I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the remote slopes of Zaphon, or the far reaches of the north, the remote parts of Zaphon. It's, again, a reference to Mount Zaphon being the Mount of Assembly. And that phrase, Mount of Assembly, is Har Moed. Har Moed. When John, in Revelation, wanted to transliterate Har Moed from Hebrew into Greek, he had to find a Greek character to approximate the Hebrew ayin. It's a character that looks like a reverse apostrophe. It's a glottal stop. There's no exact match in Greek or in English. So when Revelation was translated from Greek into English, scholars assumed that because he'd used the Greek character gamma, the original Hebrew must have been a gimel, which is a g sound. And so Har Moed, Mount of Assembly, became Har Magedon, Mount Megiddo. But there's no mountain at Megiddo, first of all. Secondly, the apocalyptic prophecies of the Old Testament, Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14, Joel 3, all place that final battle at Jerusalem. God's Mount of Assembly, Har Moed, Armageddon, is Zion, the Temple Mount. So that's what we're looking at here. And that's when the Gog-Magog conflict will come about. Now, what role does Russia have to play in this? If Rosh is not Russia, Russia will certainly play a role in it, but so will the United States and China and United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand. What Ezekiel was saying when he named these coalitions. That, first of all, he pointed to spiritual north and the mountain of Baal, who Jesus, by the way, in Matthew 12, verses 22 through 26, identified as Satan. The mountain of Satan and his military commander-in-chief, Gog, the Antichrist, the beast. It's interesting, by the way, that mountain, Mount Zaphon, today called Jebel al-Akra, is right on the shore of the Mediterranean, because in Revelation 13, the beast, the Antichrist, emerges from the sea. Well, it happened right there. We're dealing with a spiritual being, a supernatural entity. I don't know. Probably coming in from another dimension. Anyway, the sea represents chaos in the Old Testament. John may have been thinking of that when he wrote, or when he was shown this prophecy, which is why Sharon and I suggest that Leviathan, chaos, in other words, is the spirit of the human that we will call the Antichrist. But anyway, that's, I think, what Ezekiel was looking at. You've got this supernatural enemy, the fat beasts of Bashan, coming against Israel, along with, and the nations that he named were the farthest away that Ezekiel's readers would have been familiar with in each of the four cardinal directions: north, east, Persia; south, Cush; west, Put. What he was saying is the whole world is coming against Israel for that final battle. And that is exactly consistent with Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14, Joel 3. The whole world lines up against Israel for that final battle. And we got a long way to go before we get there. So let's all step back. Pray for the people of Ukraine. Pray for all those in harm's way, wherever they are this day. What's happening in Ukraine is terrifying. I am thankful that I was born into a place that's relatively safe and secure. I pray that you are in a similar place this day, wherever you are as you watch or listen to this. Things are going to get worse on earth before Christ returns at the head of that heavenly host. We still have a long way to go before we get there. Let's take advantage of the time we have to share the hope that we have in Him to those who do not yet know the saving grace of His free gift of redemption. Well, we've got a couple of places that we're going to be here in the near future. We'll talk about that coming up and wrap things up straight ahead on A View from the Bunker. Talking the walk from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker, online at vftb.net. You'll also find us on social media, on Twitter at View from Bunker, my personal Twitter feed at Derek Gilbert. Facebook, you'll find the Facebook page View from the Bunker, and also Gab, MeWe, Getter, Parlor, Derek P. Gilbert to handle at those new social media sites. On YouTube, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert. We already told you about the upcoming conferences within the next few weeks. The return of Saturn and the Great Reset. Sparta, Missouri, halfway between Branson and Springfield, March 4th through 6th, 2022, hiscallministries.com. The Hear the Watchman Eyes to See Conference, March 17th through 20th of 2022. That's in Dallas, Grapevine, Texas, to be exact. The Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center. Use promo code Gilbert20, Gilbert20 to save $20 off registration at hearthewatchman.com. Now, the new virtual conference from Skywatch TV, the Defender Conference, The Unveiling. This will launch on the web at May 13th. May 13th, all video presentations available for 90 days from that date. And list of speakers is pretty impressive. Tom Horn, Joel Richardson, Doug Woodward, Ryan Peterson, Mondo de la Vega, Dr. Judd Burton, Dr. Doug Petrovich, who's done just an amazing job with his new book, Origins of the Hebrews. He's been our featured guest for the last 4 weeks on the Bible's Greatest Mysteries online, biblesgreatestmysteries.tv. Physical evidence of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt. Don't miss those programs. Pete Garcia, Zach Drew, Jonathan Brentner, Colonel David Giamona, Tyler Gilreath, David Heavener, and Dr. Ken Johnson, Dr. Michael Lake, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis, and of course all of us from Skywatch TV, Josh Peck, Drew Graffia, Allie Henson, Donna Howell, Sharon, and myself. And if I missed anybody, forgive me, but you'll find the complete list at defenderconference.com. Defenderconference.com. We're hoping to have registration open up here within the next day or so. It's $95 for unlimited access. You can for 90 days from May 13th, but you can save $10 with an early bird discount through April 15th. And again, that link is at defenderconference.com. Now, later in May, the Prophecy Watchers Homeward Bound Conference. This is May 19th through 22nd in Colorado Springs. We'll be at the Colorado Springs Marriott. This will be amazing. Gary Stearman, we pray for Gary's complete recovery. You may have heard that he underwent a procedure to have a pacemaker installed. So we're hoping that Gary feels well enough to be there, and we plan to be in his presentation if so. Mando Gonzalez, who's been carrying the program in Gary's absence, will also be there. Other speakers include Ellie Marzulli, Bill Koenig, Bill Salas, Ken Johnson, Ryan Peterson, Dr. Tommy Ice, Nathan Jones, Randall Price, Terry James, Brandon Holthouse. Look forward to seeing him in person. One of the few preachers I know who actually preaches at his church on Sunday morning on Genesis 6 and knows what the word apkalu means. Doug Woodward will be there. David Schnitker, Lieutenant Colonel Bob McGinnis, Brent Miller Jr., Brent Miller Sr., Josh Peck will be coming with us, and we look forward to seeing you there as well. More information and registration at prophecywatchers.com, prophecywatchers.com. Now, another new conference to tell you about, the Southwest Radio Church Conference. This is July 7th through 9th of 2022 at a really cool location. This conference will be at the Ark Encounter in Williamstown, Kentucky. Sharon and Josh Peck and I were blessed to be at the grand opening of the Ark Encounter in July of 2016. We'll be back in July of 2022, Sharon and me, for this conference, along with Pastor Larry Spargimino, who's a senior evangelist and host of Southwest Radio Church, Pastor James Collins, co-host of Southwest Radio Church Ministries, Larry Stam, Pastor Greg Patton. You can find out more online. No, tickets for this one, just $29.99. $29.99, again, July 7th, 8th, and 9th at the Ark Encounter in Williamstown, Kentucky. And that we are looking forward to. Then, later in July, the Go Therefore Conference, as we return to Ohio, will be, we may be flying into Cincinnati for the Ark Encounter. Don't tell Sharon. No, if we can help it, we'll be flying into Lexington. We try to avoid big city traffic whenever we can. Anyway, we will be in the Dayton area, Brookville, Ohio, at the Harvest Revival Center, July 29th through 31st for the Go Therefore Conference. This one, besides Sharon and me, Pastor Mike Spalding, Pastor Carl Gallops, Dr. Michael Lake, David Heavener, Pastor Casper McLeod, Coach Dave Daubenmeyer, Thomas Dunn, Neil Peterson, and Kenny C. will be speaking for the first time. We look forward to seeing him again. Love Kenny C. And this will be a great conference, a wonderful gathering. July 29th through 31st, 2022, the Go Therefore Conference, gothereforeconference.com. Later in the year, we are going to Turkey. Skywatch TV's tour of Turkey. Sharon and I, along with special guest Doug Hershey, best-selling author of the books Israel Rising and Jerusalem Rising, and the founder of Ezra Adventures Tours, which had been focusing on Israel tours, but with the vaccine mandates of the last couple of years, he branched out and began running tours into Turkey. We noticed that. We called him because we noticed that the government of Turkey was not requiring a vaccine. And so we've set up a 2-week tour of Turkey, October 18th through November 3rd of 2022. We will visit the cities of the 7 churches of Revelation, Göbekli Tepe, described as the world's oldest religious community. We'll visit the Asclepion of Pergamum, which is a healing site devoted to the demigod Asclepius. You would go down there, they would let snakes crawl over you. You would report whatever nightmares you were having from being crawled on by snakes. And the priests of Asclepius would then tell you what that meant and how you were supposed to get healed. We'll also visit Abraham's home city of Haran, the underground city of Derinkuyu in Cappadocia. Derinkuyu, an underground city that may date back to the time of the Phrygians and the Sumerians who took over their kingdom and killed King Midas. But this was used by the early church to hide from the Romans. There is a cross-shaped church in the lowest level of this underground city, which housed as many as 20,000 people. And as Doug pointed out in our recent interview with him, First Peter, the letter First Peter was addressed to the churches of Cappadocia. So it's possible that that letter was read in that space where we will be in late October. We'll also see the incredible megalithic idols of Mount Nimrut. You notice the similarity to Nimrod. It's not coincidental. We'll also go to Hattusis, the capital of the mighty Hittite Empire. The Hittites were all over the Bible and the lands of the Bible. And we will also visit the city of ancient Hierapolis, the location of the Plutonion, named for the Roman god of the dead, Pluto. The Plutonion, a site sacred to, in other words, it's the gates of hell, part of this tour. This will be amazing. Some of the oldest sites of some of the oldest civilizations on Earth, artifacts from those sites. Antakya, where Christians were first called by that name. Don't miss this. It's going to be a relatively small tour. We're trying to keep it to 24 or less. October 18th through November 3rd. You can find out more at skywatchinturkey.com, skywatchinturkey.com, or I think I've got time to do this. Point your smartphone or the camera on your smartphone or tablet at the QR code on your screen if you're watching us, and that will take you right to that website. And then next March, Israel has dropped its vaccine requirements. So we are going back to Israel March 19th through 30th of 2023. Sharon and I, along with our colleagues from Skywatch TV, Donna Howell and Ali Henson, and our good friend Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat. We will be there on a 2-week tour like no other in Israel. We'll see all the sites that you want to see. Nazareth, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, Jerusalem, of course. Zev, with his research, will show us the historic locations of the crucifixion and the resurrection, not the sites that are on the tour. But we will also go to places other tours will not. Joshua's altar, Shiloh, Gilgal, Rephaim, and the newly recognized Serpent Mound of Bashan, all on the tour. And then we'll take the optional 3-day extension to Jordan, where we hope you join us for that. We're going. Hope you join us for the optional 3-day extension to Petra, the Red Desert, Wadi Rum, and Mount Nebo. And we'll explain why that's called the Mountain of the Travelers in the book of Deuteronomy, and what the travelers have to do with Ezekiel chapter 39. There's prophetic significance there to that view. Find out more online, skywatchinisrael.com, skywatchinisrael.com, or point the phone on your camera or tablet to the QR code on your screen. Thank you for taking time to give us a view or a listen wherever you are consuming this podcast. If you get a spare moment, give us a review at Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, YouTube, wherever fine podcasts are sold. And, of course, give us a like on our Facebook page. Our announcer is DC Good. And A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.